The man with the gold calls all the shots. All about the cash. It's all about the cash. Oh, all about the cash.
Hello, poker players. This is Steve again. This time I will talk about tournament variance and the tournament bell curve. This lecture is based on information first published in Tournament Poker for the Rest of Us, but I have updated it significantly. First, I will explain how tournaments are fundamentally different from cash games. Then I will introduce what I call the tournament bell curve. Finally, I will briefly discuss ICM, which is the independent chip model, and chip utility, which is the real power behind tournament poker. It should be fairly obvious that tournaments are different from cash games. Here I will explain why these differences change the nature of variance in tournaments and how this plays a critical role in how we should play our tournaments. The first obvious difference is that most tournaments have antes, which changes our EV math. Suppose we are playing a 1-2 Vegas cash game, which would start with 1.5 big blinds in the pot. But in a tournament with a big blind ante, there will be 2.5 big blinds in the initial pot. With more in the pot to win, our opening ranges will increase. So the antes encourage more risk-taking and greater variance. In a cash game, we can always chip up to the maximum buy-in, but we can only increase our tournament stack by winning pots. Once our chips are gone, we are gone. Tournament blinds and antes increase relentlessly, perhaps every 2 hours in the main event, or as fast as every 5 minutes in an online turbo event. As these blinds increase, our stack size decreases when we measure it in big blinds. In some tourneys with fast structures, our effective stack can be cut in half in just one level. So our cash game chips are always worth their face value, and we can cash them in at any time. But tournament chips are essentially just video game ammunition. We can use them to survive until they are actually worth some cash, but we can't just cash them in. So measuring our variance by our hand-by-hand results like we do in a cash game doesn't really mean much when the value of our stack changes at every level. So while cash game variance concepts are important, they don't directly help us understand variance in tournaments and what we should do about it. There are other major differences between cash games and tournaments. Tournament prize structures are nonlinear and discontinuous. We make no money at all until the bubble bursts, and then only a small fraction of the field cashes, 15% at the World Series of Poker, for example. So we go from losing our entire entry fee to winning a min cash. This is a nonlinear payoff, much different from our typical cash game session results. Tournament prize structures are also top-heavy. First place may earn 10 times more than ninth place, even though the winner isn't 10 times better. This is why you often see chopping in a tournament. It smooths out our tournament variance. These factors conspire to distort the value of our tournament chips. When we do an EV analysis, we usually calculate the chip EV of our decision. Do we expect to make chips or lose them? In a cash game, the dollar value of our expectation is exactly the same as our chip value, since the value of our chips is exactly their face value. But this is not true for tournaments. Our tournament dollar EV can be lower than our chip EV due to the impact of ICM, for example. Or it can be higher due to the impact of chip utility. I will discuss these concepts a bit later. Another way that a tournament can be different, or is different, is that the quality of our competition gets gradually stronger as the weaker players bust out. Also, players who rebuy tend to be better than average, especially in high buy-in events. So tournaments get tougher as they progress. Cash games and tournaments are so different from each other that we even measure our success differently. We measure our cash game success in big blinds per hour or sometimes big blinds per 100 hands. We may have a different win rate for different stakes. Since we have played, once we have played enough hands, we can be somewhat confident in the value of our win rate. But tournaments have ever-increasing blinds, which is like playing 1-2 for an hour, then 1-3, then 2-4, then 2-5, then 3-6, and so forth. It would be difficult to determine our win rate for each tournament level that we play, especially for a live tournament. So our normal metric for tournament play is ROI, which means return on investment. This is usually expressed as a percentage of our entry fees, including any rebuys that we might purchase. So if we win a net profit of $1,000 playing $10,000 in entry fees, our ROI would be 10%. Unfortunately, there is no place where we can find the ROI for tournament players, even famous ones. We only know how much they have won, not how much they have invested. I suspect that many players with very high earnings actually have negative or ROIs. Since we can't easily measure our hand-for-hand variance, like we do for cash games, we must employ a different measure of variance for tourneys, the tournament bell curve. To begin, let's look at the distribution of height for American Mint, shown by this plot here. This is a classic bell curve, mathematically known as a normal distribution or a Gaussian distribution. It shows that there are very few short men and very few tall men, with the average or mean at 1.75 meters. That's about 69 inches. Plus or minus one standard deviation from the mean includes 68% of all men. Plus or minus 2 sigma includes about 95% of all men, which means that 95% of all men are between 1.49 meters and 2.01 meters tall. Technically, a Gaussian distribution only applies to random events, but even non-random data can often be treated this way. So we can apply the concept of a bell curve to our tournament performances. So we can't easily treat tournament variance the same way as cash game variance, but we can think of tournament variance in terms of the tournament bell curve. We might not know what our tournament performance curve looks like, but we can make an educated guess. Suppose Hero is a strictly average player who has entered thousands of online freeze-out tournaments, each with 1,000 entrants. If his results are completely random, they will produce a normal distribution like the blue curve here, with 500th being our average place and 1 sigma being 289 places. But real tournaments don't have symmetrical bell curves like this for several reasons, such as the enrichment of the field as weaker players bust out. So instead, we might find that Mr. Average has a tournament bell curve like the red one, which is called a skewed bell curve. Suppose these tournaments play the top 15% of the field, or 150 places. We can see that Mr. Skewed cashes much less frequently than Mr. Normal does. This would be the area under the curves, which is left of the green 15% cashing line. Not only that, Mr. Skewed has far fewer top cashes. Mr. Normal wins more tournaments than Mr. Skew, so the average tournament player with a bell curve more like that of Mr. Skewed won't win as much as he might expect. We might think, well, this tournament bell curve is interesting, but it's just theoretical. It wouldn't really apply to our actual tournaments. But many years ago, I would often play an online $11 sit and go after I came home from work. It turns out that I had played 940 of them, and they always started with 10 players. First, we can see that this looks very much like a bell curve, but this one is skewed to the left, which indicates that I had more top finishes than random results would produce. Even so, I only had a small positive ROI for these tournaments. It points out the difficulty in winning money in tournaments. The key takeaway here is that the concept of the tournament bell curve is a legitimate one. In principle, we could have a similar bell curve for every type of tournament we play. This might allow us to create strategies for improving our ROI. Let's compare tournament bell curves for hypothetical tag and lag players. Mr. Tag is a strong, tight and aggressive player. Perhaps he's a bit too tight, but he plays most of his hands aggressively. Since he's a good tournament player, his average finish is fairly high, 250th out of 1,000 entries. And as indicated by the dashed line, he cashes quite often. But we can also see that he doesn't finish near the top very often. Suppose we want to change Mr. Tag's playing style so that he goes deep more often. A way to do that graphically is to widen his tournament bell curve. Essentially, we want to increase Mr. Tag's variance by taking more chances. This means he should play more hands, 3-bet more often, float more often, bluff more often, and so on. The better he is, the better he chooses his spots. With a higher variance style, Mr. Tag turns into Mr. Lag, whose bell curve is wider. He cashes more often, with more area under the curve left of the dash of the cash line, but he also finishes near the top more often. But his higher variance also results in more poor finishes. This is essentially a chip up or go home strategy. Surprisingly, these early finishes have an upside. We haven't invested as much time in the tournament that we made no money in. This sounds straightforward until we consider the actual mechanics of how we intend to increase our variance. If we do this carelessly, we will not only widen our bell curve, we will shift it to the right. You may notice from this plot that we don't have to shift our bell curve very far to the right before we cash less often and go deep less often. So the devil is in the details. We want to polarize our results by increasing our variance, but there is no simple path to do that. The truly talented tournament players have a sense for when to take their chances. EV decisions are relatively easy to make in a cash game. We simply make the highest positive EV decision we can for the hand we are playing. If we were playing perfect GTO players, this would simply be the best GTO decision. But in a real game, a slightly negative or neutral EV decision might be positive for the hand because of the specific mistakes that our opponents make. This reasoning also works in a tournament. But chip EV is not the only important factor in the tournament decision. In fact, dollar EV is the only criterion we should ever consider in either a cash game or a tournament. But dollar EV is the same thing as chip EV in a cash game, making our cash game analysis fairly easy. But this is not the case in a tournament. Most GTO solutions are based on chip EV and only chip EV. This is true for cash games and tournament models. The only thing that matters here is which actions earn the most chips for the hero. But for tournaments, the true value of our decision also depends on the prize structure, the tournament level, and the relative stacks of the remaining competitors. That means we need to understand how ICM and chip utility impact the present value of our chips. There are two major factors that can shift the expected value of our decisions: chip utility and ICM. Chip utility is a concept which is often forgotten by cash game players who jump into the occasional tournament, but it is a crucial concept to understand. In fact, Arnold Snyder has said that chip utility is the key factor in determining who makes money in a poker tournament and who doesn't. I agree that it is immensely important. This is a big topic, which I intend to cover in a future lecture, but the basic concept is simple. An easy way to visualize chip utility is to think of it as power or ammunition. The more power I have, the more of my poker skills I can utilize. The more ammo I have in battle, the more likely I will be victorious. Suppose I have a 40 big blind stack and you have only 20 big blinds. I can bust you, but you can't bust me. So when I open jam on you from the small blind, you will tend to be reluctant to call with the proper range. You will tend to play more cautiously against my aggression. That improves my fold equity, which improves the dollar EV of my decision. This allows me to play more neutral or slightly negative chip EV combos, which will widen my tournament bell curve. Hopefully this also improves my tournament ROI. Compare this to the equivalent cash game situation in which the 20 big blind villain is not going to worry about losing his stack. He can just chip up if he loses. So we have Snyder's fundamental law of chip utility. A chip won is worth more than a chip lost. This is a crucial concept to take to heart. It means that when we have superior chip utility, our expectation is higher than our chip EV would normally imply. We can play more hands and play them more aggressively than we would in the same cash game situation. This widens our tournament bell curve. Another concept important in tournament play but irrelevant in a cash game is the independent chip model, which we usually call ICM. Basically, ICM is just a mathematical model. This model tries to establish the value of our chips by assuming that the tournament ends immediately. Once the model knows the prize structure and the stack sizes of the remaining players, it determines the ICM value of each stack. We can then estimate the value of a bet by calculating the ICM value of our stack depending on the outcome. However, ICM does not recognize the skill of the players, our seat position, or when the blinds will change. Of course, this is not very important if the tournament is ending right now. So as a way to chop up the prize pool, ICM is a reasonably fair way to do it. Unfortunately, ICM math is nearly impossible to use in real time during a tournament. We don't know everyone's stack sizes, and we can't do the math in our head. But we can analyze a hand after the fact to find out whether a particular decision was the correct ICM EV decision or not. When we do that, we find that the ICM value of our chips is always lower than their chip EV. This means that a neutral value GTO decision is always a negative ICM EV decision. This ICM impact is usually only minor, but there are two situations where it is not. Near the bubble, the discontinuous nature of the price structure means that our decisions can be driven by whether we can fold to the cash or not. And ICM can have a huge impact on our EV at the final table when the price structure acceleration is at its strongest. So we have the ICM meme that a chip won is worth less than a chip lost, which is opposite to the chip utility meme. So the ICM and chip utility forces can cancel each other, at least partially and at least in some situations. But the ICM force is weak except near the bubble and the final table. So except for those situations, chip utility dominates and we can play more loosely and more aggressively. So we should think of variance somewhat differently for tournaments than we do for cash games. Although the underlying variance forces are the same for both, the continually moving blinds in a tournament means that we should look elsewhere for clues for how variance affects our tournament success. That leads us to the tournament bell curve, which gives us some clues about how to improve our ROI. We want to widen the curve in order to provide more results on the winning end of the curve, and we want to do that without shifting the curve towards the losing end. In a cash game, we are driven by chip EV decisions, often based on GTO strategies. But in a tournament, our borderline decisions should be driven by chip utility considerations because a chip we win is worth more than a chip we lose. This encourages us to widen our ranges by adding neutrals and even some slightly negative EV combos. We can also make other decisions based on neutral decisions such as 3-betting, floating, and so forth. By doing this, we can widen our bell curve without shifting it to the right. ICM can also be important, but only near the bubble and the final table. But even then, our chip utility can be still a quite large force when we have a larger stack, and can bully our opponents. This lecture was presented at the Las Vegas Wednesday Poker Discussion Group in December 2023. You can join us every Wednesday at Tommy Rockers, and you can join our Facebook group and see the agenda for our next meeting. That's all, folks.